Joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in alphabetical order. In Los Angeles, California, Wade Davis, author of Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory, and the Conquest of Everest. And with us here in studio, Charlotte Gill, author of Eating Dirt, Deep Forests, Big Timber, and Life with the Tree Planting Tribe. J.J. Lee, author of The Measure of a Man, the story of a father, a son, and a suit. Madeline Sonic, author of Afflictions and Departures, and Andrew Westall, author of The Chimps of Fauna Sanctuary, a Canadian story of resilience and recovery. And it's great to have all four of you around the table here. And Wade, we hate you, given that your background in Los Angeles, California looks simply glorious. But we're glad that you're part of the broadcast as well today. This has become a bit of a tradition for us here at TVO. We have had the Charles Taylor Prize nominees in here a few years in a row now, and we are delighted to welcome all of you. And Wade, I'll start with you, if you wouldn't mind. Tell us about your book.
Well, my book is really about the epic story of the first British attempts to climb Mount Everest in 1921 and 22 and 24. And famously, on June 8th of 1924, George Mallory, aged 37, the most illustrious climber in Britain, and his young companion, Sandy Irvine, a lad of just 22, were seen cresting the northeast ridge of Everest, going strong for the summit when the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth. And the question always has been, did they get to the top before they succumbed? But from the very beginning of this project 12 years ago, I was never interested in that question as much as who were these men who went to the top? And my sense was that having gone through the agony of the First World War, I knew from their class and their age and their background that all would have seen the trenches. And my thought was that perhaps for that generation, not that they were cavalier about death, that death had no mystery for them. They had seen so much of it that it had nothing more to teach them save that of their own. And life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And that explained why they were prepared perhaps to take a level of risk or accept a level of risk on Everest that might have been unimaginable before the war. So really, this book is the first book to put those expeditions in the context of their times. And to do that, I took each of the 26 men who went to Everest on those 3 expeditions, and I was able to find out where each man was every single day of the 4 years and 4 months of the Great War. And that really creates a backdrop of the story.
Charlotte Gill, Eating Dirt. What's that about?
I used to be a professional tree planter. I did that job for 17 years, and Eating Dirt is really the story of my rather lengthy career in reforestation in Canada. It's also a natural history of the global forest and the forest that exists in Canada.
How many trees do you think you've planted over the years?
I would say well over 1 million. I stopped counting at 1 million.
Well over 1 million.
Well over 1 million.
And have you gone back to visit some of what you planted?
I have, actually.
How's it looking?
Some of those trees are, you know, very large Christmas trees now. Some of them are almost 20 years old.
Gotcha. J.J. Lee, The Measure of a Man.
Well, I guess you could say it's a memoir, a social history, and a sartorial speculation on the nature of the suit, and it's how it interfaces with manhood. At the very, very core of it is my attempt to understand my father, who was an alcoholic, who was abusive to my mother, and I inherited his last suit, not a very good suit, and I took the time to try to alter it to make it fit me. And by doing that, I used that as a landscape to explore my relationship with my father. So all in that, it's intertwined, interwoven is this tapestry of stories about fathers and sons, that conversation about clothes, and how actually it's an essential conversation that can occur between a father and son. And what we can learn with these strange heirlooms that we get from our parents.
Where is that suit now?
It is hanging in the closet of the King Edward Hotel, and I'm contemplating wearing it on Sunday. When
you put that suit on, you've put it on before.
I've tried it. I haven't worn it since I've altered it.
You haven't
not
worn it?
Not in front of other people.
But you might do it this weekend.
I'm thinking about it. I don't know how I feel.
Madeline Sonic, your book.
Yes, my book is a story of my young life, taking place between the early 60s and early 70s. And it's also a historical overview of that time. And I started actually writing the book not as a book. I began writing it as an essay. It started as an essay, and then the essay just kept kind of coming as I remember more about my past and my childhood until the momentum, climbed, and I realized I had a book, and so that's, how the book kind of came into being.
You're born in Detroit?
I was born in Detroit, yeah. I lived in the States until I was 10. We moved to Windsor, Ontario. A lot of the book takes place in Windsor, Ontario. But I'm looking at larger issues in the world, too, so.
But you grew up in, I mean, it wasn't quite Eisenhower's America, right? I mean, by the time you're on the scene, it's John Kennedy, it's Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
And probably as you come of age, it's Richard Nixon.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I remember Nixon well, yeah.
Okay, Andrew Westall, your book.
Hi. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I moved into a pretty amazing little animal sanctuary on the south shore of Montreal called the Fauna Foundation. And Fauna's home to over 100 rescued animals. But their claim to fame, their most famous residents, is a family of chimpanzees who were rescued from a biomedical laboratory in Upper New York State. And when they were in the laboratory, they were taken from their mothers just days after they were born, put in small cages, subjected to a whole bunch of different surgeries and invasive research. And then they were rescued when their lab was shutting down and brought to this place on the south shore of Montreal by a woman named Gloria Grow. And 2 years ago, Gloria invited me to move into her sanctuary to work as a volunteer caregiver with the chimpanzees for 10 weeks and to write their biography. And that's what my book is about.
Why'd you say yes?
Because I've wanted to spend time with chimpanzees in the flesh since I was probably 2 years old. Yeah, it's
Jane Goodall.
Jane Goodall. I mean, the story I tell is I used to sit reading National Geographic stories of Jane Goodall. I grew up in Ontario with my feet against my parents' heater so that I could feel like I was in equatorial Africa.
That's nice.
Yeah.
She was in here, I don't know how long ago it was, 1 or 2 years ago. And I have never seen this camera crew as quiet and as moved, and the director reminds me in my earpiece, and the director, as when she gave an interview to us for this program.
Yeah.
She's truly extraordinary, and you obviously wanted a piece of that.
She's a hero. She's a hero. I got to meet her finally last fall, and it was the time of my life.
I want to do a little follow-ups with each of you now on some of these themes that you've brought forward, and you're all getting kudos for the profundity with which you have told your stories. And Wade, I want to go again to you first on this with a follow-up here, because one of the climbers that you chronicle in your book has this wonderful quote that says, "The price of life is death." Tell us what that means.
Well, that was a comment that was made by Bentley Beetham as the expedition retreated from Everest in the wake of the disaster that had killed Mallory and Irvin. And the immediate response to that disaster was interesting. Noah Odell, for example, who was the last to see them alive and who performed heroic athletic efforts in an attempt to go up and down the mountain with the hope that they might still be found. The minute they knew they were dead, they retreated from the mountain, and in his journal there is no comment of it again. He simply does what he did when his brother was killed at the front, a single line, then life moves on. Colonel Norton famously said, "We accepted their death with the same cold indifference that we had learned to accept death on the Western Front. Still, it was very hard." And then what that guy is saying, Beetham, is that the price of life is death. And he goes on in that quote to say, "Up there on the mountain are two still forms, yesterday full of manhood and grace, today close together." And then the key line, he says, "And they will never know the experience of rot." In other words, they will never be decayed. And this was something that haunted men from the Western Front, which is one of the reasons, incidentally, that cremation was born out of that war. Until World War I, nobody in Europe indulged cremation as a way of dealing with the dead. In the wake of the war, it became the preferred form of burial for tens of thousands who had lived 4 years and 4 months in the constant presence of rotting flesh.
Charlotte, that's natural beauty of a sort. You dealt with natural beauty of a sort with all of those trees that you were planting, but I want to start with this. When you see trees, obviously depending on who you are, you see something different. What do you see when you see a tree?
I have a natural affinity towards trees. They're sort of like my filter in the world now. Whenever I travel somewhere, I notice the trees, whereas perhaps if I had never been a tree planter, it would be just something in the background. That said, a tree planter's workplace is a clear cut, and that's naturally a fairly scarred place. And yet, in the course of my long career, 17 years planting trees, I think I was able to begin to see some of the beauty at the edges of the stump fields. And I think probably many tree planters feel the same way.
Because a logger, of course, sees a job, and you know, somebody who runs a forestry industry company sees dollar signs. What do you see?
Tree planters are sort of famously caught in the middle, in between the environmental movement and the logging industry. Of course, we work for the logging industry. We're, you know, a very small piece of that very large machine. It's an ambivalent place to live. I think that most tree planters acknowledge that every day when they go to work.
Do you think of it as a renewable resource?
Forests, I had no idea what the answer to that question was when I started writing the book. Does tree planting work? Is it possible to create a sustainable forest? And the conclusion that I came to after doing lots of research was that planting trees merely sets the stage for a rehabilitation that will happen over several centuries after the logging has occurred.
More to come. More to come. JJ, I'm going to ask the question that everybody's got on their mind right now.
Sure.
What does JJ stand for?
JJ stands for James Jason, and it's a funny story. I actually never knew it was my name until I was 7 years old. Grade 2, first day of grade 2 class, teacher comes up and goes, James Jason Lee. And this is back in the day when immigration, you know, there wasn't as much. And so I was like the only Chinese kid in the class. And she kept on saying, James Jason Lee, and staring right at me, like burning her eyes into me. And I was like, that's not my name. I'm JJ. I was like, that's weird. Some kid's named James Jason is close to my name. And she goes, you, what's your name? And I go, my name is JJ. She says, come up here. And then she showed me the class that says James Jason Lee. I guess that's my name.
Because
and
everybody always called you JJ.
JJ, and it's even shorter. As a child, I was actually known as Jay. So I went home that day and really cut into my mom. I really let her know, like I was very embarrassed not to know that that was my real name all my life. So, but yeah, so it's JJ's. I prefer JJ. I don't answer to James or Jason. I just ignore it. Still do.
Have you ever met the actress Jennifer Jason Leigh?
No.
You have an eerily familiar name.
Yes, yes, yes. No, I've never met her. I like to talk to her about the film Georgia, though, one day.
Do you? Where are your parents born?
My parents were born in mainland China. My mother spent a few years in Hong Kong. My dad ended up in Canada at the age of 4 and grew up in Sherbrooke, Quebec. And, you know, sort of played hockey, did the whole, you know, just grew up raised by Jesuits, kind of in that context of the school system, and was raised by my great-grandparents, so not his parents, but my great-grandparents.
So do you have a Chinese name as well?
Yes, and it's, I'm going to say it wrong, but it's Susim.
Susim?
Yes, Susim. Close to Susan, so I figured there's a Johnny Cash song in there somewhere.
You're the boy named Susim.
That's right, that's
okay,
right.
Got it. Okay, Madeline, I've done a little looking into your work, and one of the things that we're told is that you've developed an experimental nonfiction genre that you call fracture.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It depends on who I'm speaking to, but the fracture uses many different techniques. So hard-boiled journalism is one of the techniques that I've used in my work, and then I've used fictional techniques. And then I've used techniques that are used often just in historical writing. And what I found doing that and presenting kind of history in the way I did was it does tend to fracture one's perception of linear time. When you read my book, you don't look at time in the same way again. I don't. There should be a warning on the cover, I think, you know. You will never be able to perceive time in the same way because it will make you consider time in a different way. I mean, in a larger view.
Just to follow up on that a little bit.
Sure.
You'll consider time in a different way because of what that you do in the book?
Because I'm looking back and forward as well as staying in the moment of my childhood. I'm kind of moving through all kinds of different perspectives.
So it's not a linear chronology, so to speak.
No, and
you're messing with us.
I'm messing with you, yeah. That's what I learned how to do. So I mean, you know, yeah, I like to do that. And I mean, I messed with myself when I did it too, you know, because I started looking at time differently. So it was very kind of self-sustaining. We start writing that way, and then you start seeing time as a different entity, and then you can't help but kind of write that way.
But when you write it, do you write it as one linear chronological story and then cut and paste it? No, you're writing it bouncing all over the place.
Yes, bouncing all over.
Okay, gotcha. Andrew, I'm going to ask you, I guess, one of the same questions I asked Jane Goodall, which is, were you ever afraid?
Listen, the first moment I walked into the chimp house at Fauna, the first emotion I had was fear. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out if that's what I wanted to welcome the reader into the book with. We have a pretty mixed up understanding of what a chimpanzee is in the wild. And we had the cultural impression of a chimp is that they're, you know, incredibly violent and we should be scared of them. And while there's some truth to the fact that they're so much stronger than us and that they're unpredictable because we're not chimpanzees, and these chimps in particular have been so messed with, they're not in the wild, you know, they've all been psychologically damaged. There's some truth to that. But I didn't want to contribute too much to everyone just thinking the same thing they've always thought about chimps. So I open with the fear of walking into that chimp house, the sound, the welcoming committee, the banging, the screaming, and then it completely dissipates after 2 pages, and the rest of the book is about me building relationships with these chimpanzees and being welcomed into their world.
Okay, the book, it dissipates in 2 pages in the book, but in real life, how long did it take before you felt comfortable?
Almost the exact same amount of time. Huh. I had this incredibly fearful moment walking in, hearing this smelling, I mean the smell and the humidity, and I walked around the corner and I was introduced to Binky, but I wasn't introduced to just Binky, I was introduced to the bubster, right? And he looked incredibly terrifying to me. He was this big hulking mass stampeding back and forth in his enclosure. And then 5 minutes later, he was yelping with excitement as he was eating little gummy bear vitamins out of Gloria's hand.
How big is he?
Almost, I think 200 pounds. And so if he were to stand up, maybe 5 feet, but just rippling with muscle.
As we sit here, we're 5 days removed from the Academy Awards, so I can't help but ask this question since the picture got nominated for an Academy Award. Did you see Planet of the Apes?
Of course I did,
You did?
I reviewed it actually.
And?
I think those scenes of the chimps in the laboratory, in the domed enclosure where they're all being social together, those scenes, for me, I felt like I was looking into a window in a zoo, and it was all CGI. I thought it was an incredible job. The animal behavior consultants they had did an amazing job. The chimpanzees in that movie, their facial expressions were a little more human than they actually are in real life. And that's because viewers need to be brought in to their characters and their emotions. But the way that they carried themselves and their gestures was incredibly accurate.
And they didn't win.
They didn't win.
Didn't win the Oscar.
No, and I thought
Crazy.
the guy who played Caesar should have won an Oscar.
Yeah, he was terrific. Okay, as you heard in the introduction to the program, you know, we've sort of looked at all of your books and we've tried to figure out whether there is a single theme that sort of runs through it. And humor us for a second here, because there sort of is. You know, Wade, your book is about, if you like, a kind of a bond of brothers that develops as these people scale this incredible mountain. And JJ, obviously talking about your father, there's family that runs through that. Charlotte, with your book, you know, the family ties, I guess, that develop among, or not, that develop among people who are planting trees. You wrote about your family. Chimps are our closest. So anyway, we're going to pursue this notion of family, if you'll humor us with this theme as we go here. Wade, tell us about this group of men. You told us about the 26 and you looked into all of their backgrounds leading up to the scaling of Mount Everest. Did they, in effect, become family? Did they become brothers as they were doing this?
Well, you know, these were a marvelous generation of men who were not prepared to yield their feelings to analysis. These were men of grit and kind of dignity that, you know, is really from such a different era. I mean, one classic example is on the approach march to Everest in 1921, Arthur Kellis, a high-altitude physiologist, literally died of exhaustion and was buried in the shadow of a fort on the Tibetan plateau called Kampazong. And the great hero of my book really is a Canadian, Oliver Wheeler, who was not Mallory who found the key to the mountain, it was Wheeler. And Wheeler would spend more time higher on the mountain, alone on the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain than anyone on that expedition. And on the day they buried Kellis, I also found Wheeler's son alive in Vancouver and living 5 doors from where I was born. And when I visited him, he gave me this real treasure, which were the journals that his father kept in 1921, which had never been seen by a historian. And on the day that they buried Kellis, the entire journal entry reads simply, well, they buried the old boy in the morning, thought it would be the afternoon, terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals. And that seemed so strange to me. How would you miss the internment of one of your fellow climbers as you walked across Tibet? Well, I was later able to ascertain that there was a terrible incident on the Western Front whereby he, as a Royal Engineer, had been forced to really bury some people alive. And what was fascinating is that when he did not attend the funeral of Kellis, there was not a single criticism in any of the letters, any of the journals, any of the accounts of the expedition, because if there was any dignity on the Western Front, it was that kind of private sphere where you were allowed to place around yourself as you contemplated your own imminent demise and that of your friends and your brothers, your comrades. You have to remember that on the Western Front, every man expected to die every day. You know, the United States in 10 years in Iraq has lost 4,500 boys and girls. That was a week's casualties for the British armies. So there was this sort of incredible dignity which they held very tight to the chest as they marched across Tibet, and indeed as they went up the flank of the mountain.
So we should be careful about applying our 21st century sensibilities to loss, to family, on men who did something 100 years ago. Is that what you're saying?
I think looking back on the kind of the sensibilities, the ethos of these men, I certainly found in doing the research over 12 years that it was as difficult for me to understand those men at some level as it was to understand the Tibetans of that era that I also researched with great rigor. You know, particularly in terms of sort of sensuality and sexuality. I mean, you know, famously, George Mallory was sort of pursued by every conceivable man at Cambridge. I mean, the experimentation of sexuality at Cambridge before the First War was extraordinary. John Maynard Keynes was known as the iron copulating machine, you know, and yet that sexuality cannot be judged through the lens of gender issues today. It would be absurd. So you really had to look back in time and try to judge everything that occurred from the values of that moment.
Now, I must confess, we've done many shows on Keynesian economics here, but that was never one of the attributes that I recall being placed on John Maynard Keynes. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. That's a new one, Wade. Well done. Charlotte, the process of planting trees, of getting eaten alive by bugs, of having to deal in very uncomfortable circumstances, probably with some people who are not like you. Does that create a happy family circumstance or a dysfunctional family circumstance or something different? Help us with this.
Well, the subtitle of the book is, in part, Life with the Tree Planting Tribe. And I think there is something very familial about that occupation. Everyone's living together, working together, breathing and eating together. The work is sort of famously full of adversity. There is the weather and the bugs. And I have this really unscientific idea that there's something about physical adversity that bonds people together, even though it's an unpleasant experience, tree planting. Everyone is doing exactly the same work. It has a very equalizing effect in that way. When I was writing the book, my big hope was that I could make the reader feel as if they were there with us, out in the clear cuts getting rained on and eaten by bugs. And not only that, they would feel by the end of the book as if they were part of that family. And when they closed the covers at the end, they would feel as if they had stepped out of something they would miss.
We use that word family a lot, though, nowadays. You know, you hear it all the time from people who play in the same hockey team talk about feeling like they're in the same family, or, you know, people who are in the same class, you know, by the end of the school year, oh, we were like a family. Does this word get tossed around a little too cavalierly these days?
Perhaps. I think that there are lots of situations that are like families, like when I go to work and spend time with my tree planting compatriots, it's like a kind of family. We're occupational siblings, but that bond kind of comes and goes as our work routines come and go.
And I guess the fact is you will probably see more of these folks than you will of your own family,
In
of
many
your blood.
ways, that's true.
Yeah. JJ, I'm not going to call you Jason.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Did the writing of this book ultimately, you told us earlier your father was a fairly controversial fella who had his faults. By the time you got to the end of writing this book, did you like him more?
That's you know, I'm going to bring together two ideas because what Charlotte just said. You kind of write these things and you don't really remember that you're going to involve other people. Like, they become part of your family. The reader all of a sudden is inside your family. I didn't really understand that as I wrote the book. I just felt I was explaining my experiences and trying to do it in an artful way. Let's put it that way. And what happened was the very good novelist Ian Weir just commented recently. It's like, why is he doing this? Like he had the sort of the injury. He suffered my injuries, right? Like the problems that I had with my father. He suffered them too as a reader. And it was, it fascinates me that you forget that you're really bringing someone into your world, and they do become part of your family, and you do, form this sort of emotional bond. But I don't, and I guess the trick is like, how far do you take them on your own journey? And I think my journey might be really different from what the reader walks away with. The reader can kind of actually forget the story. I'm still living the story, and I can nearly not remember how I felt at the end of the book. I can't, that sense of closure, the word has been thrown up before, closure, and it makes me really uncomfortable because I don't think that's how we live our lives, or how we, in some ways I'm still interacting with my father. I'm still negotiating with his legacy. And this book has been really interesting. And this, I like what you said, Madeline, because you talked about fractured. I've tried to flatten time as much as possible in the book. It's because if you didn't, the way you feel and think and use memory, everything is nested within each other. The past has you might be talking about the past, but you might want to foreshadow or jump ahead. And so they all kind of interlock and become one thing. Time does become very flat and become one moment, the moment of reading. And so I don't know if the book's not over in some ways, because the book didn't end when I finished writing it, if that makes any sense at all.
It does, but I'm going to ask you about that suit, because he left one suit of clothes in the cupboard, which you altered, and which you have not worn since, but you have it with you at the King Eddie Hotel.
That's right.
How long since your father passed?
2001.
And you haven't worn that set of clothes in 11 years.
No.
Why not?
He was a difficult man. He did some things that some people think were horrible. He abused my mother. I remember at the age of 13, a really violent night where a knife was used on my mother. And she bled and she went to the hospital, and I didn't see her for what felt like a year. She lived in the Salvation Army Hotel in Montreal. And so what do you do? Like, that's what you remember when you look at the suit. That's, but I felt compelled to bring it. I felt that people might need to know, maybe it would take away some of the mystique of it, that they have to understand what I was actually physically dealing with. So the suit does have a mystique. It has all these burdens in its lining. A suit it's got as much baggage as, I guess, a crew going up a mountain, because in the lining, there's scent, there's follicles, all that stuff. My father's in there. And then there's the cut of the suit itself. It has so many presumptions about what it means to be a man in the cut of the suit, the way a suit feels, the way a suit tries to make you look. It has all these presumptions. And so the social history part was to explore what we need or what we've wanted over the suits since the first suit was made maybe 500 years ago.
But in some sense, as long as you don't put that suit on, something continues, right? Maybe the day you put that suit on, the story somehow comes to an end?
Oh, you sound like a film director now. I gotta get a nice mo. No, that would be nice. I've learned something. The memoir is not like life. And that's all the more rich. Life is all the more rich for that reason. And I think I find that really interesting from a historiographical level way, because you must have gone through lots of memoirs and tried to parse what really happened from what was recalled. I find that really interesting.
Wade, is that true? Did you look through many other memoirs to try to piece it all together?
Well, interesting enough, JJ, two of the most interesting biographies of two of the key climbers were written by their sons. And those two books really reminded, when I learned of your book, that it really reminded me of the tone and the temper of those two books. And so in that case, I had to go through the filter, be like trying to understand your father through your book. But I also, of course, was able to use primary documents. And of course, doing a pure work of history, whenever possible, you're seeking the freshest documents. So, what really helped me were these primary journals that I found, particularly the one of Wheeler. I mean, I think it's just incredible that Canadians don't realize that the guy who found the route to the mountain that climbers use to this day, who assault the mountain from the north, was pioneered by a Canadian, the first Canadian on Everest, and we don't even know his name, the great Oliver Wheeler.
We know it now. Madeline, I'm not so sure sort of primary documents were important in the putting together of your book because you lived it, But how much of what, how much of what went into your book of growing up in Detroit in the 1960s, a very violent time in American history, is of the memory of a 6, 7, 8-year-old child, and how much of it did you have to get from your folks?
Yes. Well, a lot of the research that went into the book, deals with that, because of course I didn't know. I wasn't really cognizant of a lot of it. Just a few little details, but as I've written about it, like just things that I recall, that my mother calling my father, saying the president had been shot, those kind of things.
Now, you were 3 when that happened, so you couldn't have remembered that.
Yeah, well, I remember, because it was such, it was an emotional thing, so I do remember the phone call, and I remember that, but I didn't know, I didn't know what a president was, so like, why would they, shoot it? Like, what was happening, right? So, and there was always that thing, too, when you're growing up, that your parents try to protect you, or they just don't want your interference, so they're always telling you to, mind your own business and, close your ears to this or whatever. But yeah, so I had to do a lot of research, and that was very interesting. I mean, I did research on the time, and I also had to find out things about my parents too, like do research in that area, the research that I could do, looking into genealogy and things like that, which is so much easier to do now, with all these internet resources. So it was a really interesting thing to do. I learned a lot.
Now, of course, Detroit, I guess, was it in '68? Was I mean, I won't say burned to the ground, but it was one of many American cities on a certain night that had a very difficult time. Do you remember that firsthand?
I wasn't actually living in Detroit then. I was living in Chicago at that time, but I mean, there was always something, right? There was always something that was kind of on the television, but mostly, what was on the television were the soap operas that my mother loved and watched, and she had her favorites, and I think that's where I learned all about relationships, which isn't really a great place to learn about relationships between men and women, and all the babies that were being adopted and that kind of thing was. I thought that's just natural. You have a baby, you put it up for adoption. Why wouldn't you? So
did you watch the soaps with your mom?
Oh, I did. Yeah.
What did you like?
General Hospital was her favorite. So I remember naming one of my dolls Jessie. Because that was So those kind of things were a lot more. I mean, there were things that I saw a lot more of.
Did you have a Luke and a Laura as well?
No, I didn't.
They were big in General Hospital, if I recall.
Yeah. No, it was Jessie at the time. She was the star. Yeah. So.
Admission here, I might have caught a couple of episodes of General Hospital with my mother too. Possible. I'm not confirming that. Rumor has it. Andrew, again, if we can sort of play on this theme of family here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As you looked at the chimps, I mean, the whole theme of family must have come out as you watched them do what they did.
Well, I'm really actually kind of stunned that you're framing all this as family, and I'm not kidding you. Well, let me go back a bit. This idea of closure and this idea of writing a book and being finished with it, I've never felt that way. And I'm still unpacking all the experiences I had at the Chimp House, much the same way JJ's unpacking his story. And I'm telling you, Steve, this morning, it occurred to me on the way to work that my book is about family. It's very, very strange that you're bringing this up right now, because I'm always thinking of a new theme that I'm realizing and noticing in the book. But early on in the book, I introduced the chimps by saying they're a family, but they're not related as any normal family would be. But what they're related through is the fact that they lived together, they suffered together, they struggled together, and they triumphed together.
That's family.
And to me, that's family. And so there's the chimpanzee family. There's only one pair of half-sisters. All the rest of them are unrelated. I mean, all chimpanzees in North America are related to a certain degree because they're all related to chimps that were brought over in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. But what's also amazing about the Chimp House is there's this added dimension of family, because Gloria has enlisted her 2 sisters to work in the Chimp House with her. it's a total family operation.
Family affair.
It's a family affair, and I spent more time almost with Gloria's sisters than I did with Gloria. So that there's the whole Gloria Grove family working with this family of chimpanzees, and they're all, I mean, it's impossible to draw a line between the humans and the chimps in the chimp house in terms of their relations and their sort of family status.
So this morning, the theme of family came to you, and of course
Yeah.
your book is about your family, your book is about your family. Wade, I wonder whether that notion of family was sort of somewhere in the back of your head as you were trying to tell that story about Mount Everest.
I don't think it was really conscious, but you know, both my grandfathers were at the front, and my grandfather on my father's side was a doctor at a casualty clearing station, a surgeon, and much of the more poignant things that happened were when these waves of wounded would come back to the casualty clearing stations. I mean, Howard Somerville, for example, who was Mallory's closest friend on the mountain in 1922 and 24, he was a surgeon at the Somme front, and he had been told to expect perhaps 1,000 casualties in the first week of the battle. Well, he and one other doctor walked out onto their 6-hour shift on the morning of July 1st, 1916, and found themselves surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys, stacked up, as it was said, like cordwood, and he had to decide who would live and who would die. And he never came back from Everest. He became a medical missionary and devoted the rest of his life to saving the living, that he might sweep away memories of the dead. And so in that sense, I think perhaps wondering who my grandfather was, because he was killed with my grandmother in a car accident in 1943. So perhaps that had some role in it, but largely I wanted to understand the nature of a kind of man that doesn't exist anymore, a man who lived in an era before people were prepared to litter the world with themselves and sort of litter their world with their feelings. I just admire those kinds of Brits, the grit, the determination, the dignity, the discretion, the decorum. Great men.
Stiff upper lip.
More than that.
Sure, more than that, of course. Charlotte, how about you? Was that notion of family somewhere in your head as you were writing your book?
I think for me, because I had worked with the same bunch of people, the story in my book is set over the course of 1 year in the life of tree planters. And because I had worked with these people for so long, some of them 10 years or more, they already felt like my family. In many ways, we are the closest we're ever going to be in the middle of the season when we're the most frozen or just pushed right to the edge of exhaustion. I think I probably find a lot of resonance in a story like Wade's, because to me there's something really curious about humans, that we have to just push ourselves right to the edge of what it means to be alive in order to feel truly alive. And that's something that tree planters must share in a way, because we're all attracted to this job and we stay there for, some of us, quite a long time.
Okay, let's explore the influence that this country has had on all of you. You are nominated for one of the top literary prizes that Canada has to offer, the Charles Taylor Prize. And I want to get some sense from all of you, and Andrew, let's start with you here, whether or not living in Canada, being a Canadian, somehow uniquely contributed to what ended up in your book. If it's not there, don't push it, but I'm wondering if it was.
I don't know, but I'm totally willing to discuss it. I think about it all the time. When I was younger, I used to be much more knee-jerk about it, and I used to say, as Canadians, we're just so much more free thinkers than other people. I don't know that the more traveling I've done, I'm not entirely sure that's true. That may have just been the youthful me talking, but I think if it impacts me at all, that thought of being a free-thinking Canadian, it's this feeling that I can go into a situation and speak the truth in a way, and I don't know if this has to do with being Canadian or not.
But it might.
It might. That's as far as I'm willing to go.
We'll take that. Okay. Wade, you've spent a lot of time in the States these days, but of course you are Canadian. Would you take a kick at that question as well?
Well, I work and live all around the world because, as an explorer in residence of the geographic, my job really is to travel the world. When I think of what Canada did to help me in all of my work, I go back to very practical things. For example, the training I got in English grammar at Lower Canada College, where as a young boy of 13, I literally had to memorize the 120 potential sentence errors. And back in that era, if you made a mistake, you got whacked on the wrist with a ruler. I mean, that was the best training I ever had. Or the very fact that when I first dreamed of becoming a writer, there was something called the Canada Council. And you could say that I'm a living example of the abuse of the Canada Council process in the sense that I've had in my life, I'm now 58, but when I was young I had 3 Canada Council grants, not one of which actually ended in the book that I had hoped it would have ended in, but those grants gave me the confidence to go on to, in fact, write 15 books. And so I think we should be very proud of the way that Canada is willing to, take a gamble on a young creative person who's got a dream. And that kind of opportunity is much more difficult to find in a place like the United States. And we have this sort of amazing support for Canadian writers. And we have these great heroes like Scott McIntyre at Douglas and McIntyre, or Louise Dennis at my publisher, Knopf. I mean, these are really extraordinary Canadian figures. I think everybody at this table being recognized with such grace by the Charles Taylor Prize, I think all of us would lean immediately on the publishers who have helped us so much to do this work.
Well, a good follow-up, I'm hoping, for a guy who's traveling the world for National Geographic then, is the Canadian outdoors, which would have been a huge part of your past. Did that have any influence in the pages of your book?
Well, I was very fortunate to be of a generation which really grew up in the bush, and the skill sets that I acquired working as a hunting guide, as a logger, as a park ranger were skills that I carried all through my life, in the Amazon or in Tibet. So in that sense, I suppose, I was drawn to Everest in part because I began to climb mountains. I mean, Oliver Wheeler, for example, famously traversed the entire massif of Assiniboine with Tom Longstaff with his father, and that's exactly why he ended up getting recruited to the Everest expedition. Well, when I was a park ranger, before I was a park ranger at 16, I climbed that mountain in the Canadian Rockies, with a hard hat and a pair of running shoes. So that sense of being, close to the bush, and with that wonderful sense that the weight of the North hovers in the Canadian imagination and defines the essence of the national soul, I think is something very powerful. And I've just written another book called The Sacred Headwaters, which is sort of a call for Canadians to be more cautious about what in fact is going on in our hinterland, because as most of us have become thoroughly urban, we like the idea of the North, but we rarely go there. But the people who are going there right now are creating a kind of tsunami of industrial development that is sweeping over every wild corner of Canada. So I think that's something we all need to pay attention to.
Okay, let's take a step back and go over that first question again. Okay, Madeline, let's go with you here. Your life started in the States, but of course you've been in Canada for a long time.
Yes.
How much of being Canadian and how much of Canada do you think ends up in the pages of your book?
Most of it is kind of set in Windsor, Ontario, and that's the place I say I grew up. Even though I only lived there 4 years, it was like a really eventful 4 years, let's say. And and I think, like Wade, I have to say that the country supports its writers, and I doubt if I didn't live here that I would be a writer. I mean, I've lived in other countries. I lived in England, and yeah, I really think that being a Canadian writer is wonderful. It's allowed me to write living in this country.
JJ, is there something about living in Canada that uniquely contributed to that book being the way it turned out?
Well, it's funny because part of the story of my family is that, of course, we're immigrants. My parents immigrated, and so that sort of disjunction or rupture in sort of a cultural continuity, let's say, of China, or obviously must have contributed to some of the stress that we felt in our domestic life, in our family life, the crazy things that happened. And I've been asked since the book's come out about the Chinese-ness of the book, and it's been really a hard question to answer. And if you'll give me a second, it's just what happens with the book is that I don't think you can imagine the book being written out of the Canadian context, the Canadian immigration experience. And the Chinese-ness, which I feel 100% Chinese. I don't like being referred to a banana. I think it's just the worst thing to be referred as. As a banana, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. So, and that's come up in, I was signing a book and there was a Chinese woman said, "Oh, so what's it like being a banana?" And it was just like,
had you heard that before?
No, I've heard the term, yes, before. It's like there's also pencil and there's other, yellow on the outside and different color on the inside. That's the idea, right? And it shocked me because I felt that I was, that I am Chinese. But now, interesting enough, the book itself, I'm beginning to ask myself how is it Chinese, or is it Chinese, and what does it mean to be Chinese in this context? And I find that really an interesting, maybe another step for me to take as a memoirist, to look at the full palette of that journey of my whole family to Canada. And that, my great-grandparents are buried on Mount Royal Cemetery. My father's there now, my grandfather's there now. And we've had a presence in Canada for actually the whole century, even though they came in waves. Like they would work, go back to China, father children, and then come back and work in Canada.
So even though you're on the West Coast now, most of your family's buried in Montreal.
Yeah, I expect I'll be buried in Mount Royal too one day.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think that would be my preferred place of resting. So I mean, I don't know how more Canadian you can get than wishing to be buried on top of Mount Royal Mountain.
Nice. So. Obviously, the outdoors, the Canadian outdoors is a huge part of what your book is all about. But had somebody like you written a book like this about this experience in another country, would it be vastly different? Or is there something about the Canadian experience of doing this that makes it different from other places in the world?
In the course of reading to write this book, I discovered all kinds of tree planting projects all over the world. But from what I could gather, there was really nothing like what goes on the scale that it goes on in Canada. There are literally thousands of people who go out and do this job during the summers every year in Canada. I don't think this book would exist for me if I hadn't lived in Canada. I mean, quite literally, I got to know Canada because of planting trees. I moved here from the US when I was 18. Within a year, I had started planting trees. So I got to know the contours and the landscape of this country by hand and on foot. I live where I do because of planting trees. I wrote this book about 3 provinces in Canada and about the forests that exist in the northern parts of the continent here, because most of us live on the border in the south. It was fundamental, it was essential to the writing of Eating Dirt, I think, the Canadian wilderness experience.
Can I also add, though, that I find tree planters have an incredible swagger to them. That it's very OHL hockey league kind of. Like there's like, you have that sort of like, there's a toughness to the great tree planters, and you're among.
I don't swagger though.
You have a swagger, and I think that's and and it's like a hockey-esque swagger to it that I think I think there's a Canadiana component to it.
Swagger.
Yes, a beautiful,
I'm
graceful.
proud to have a graceful
swagger.
Where do you live now?
I live in Powell River, British Columbia.
Okay, so the 2 British Columbians are having it out on this program right now. Obviously, there's something going on here. We got 5 minutes left here, and I want to pick up on something that you just said, Madeline, because you said it as if it were obvious, but I think there's a great debate in this country about whether or not we, in fact, do care about our authors, whether we do support our authors, whether we do love our authors. There's certainly plenty of evidence to go around that suggests that with a very small, very few exceptions, maybe not. You seem to think there is. How about you? What's your view on this?
I think I'm worried about the future in terms of supporting art and writers in this country. But that said, I've been very lucky myself with grants and council grants. I would not have written my first book without 3 council grants, which on the grand scheme are drops in the bucket, I hope. I like to think, but for me, were fundamental, and therefore I wouldn't be here with my second book. But I got to say, I'm not sure what's going to happen in the next few years around Arts Council, around the way money's going to get moved around and put sort of different earmarks on, and suddenly, I mean, what happened with the periodicals just a couple of years ago is I think indicative of what might end up happening to Arts Council.
But I'm even going beyond austerity budgets and that kind of thing, which is what I think you're referring to. I'm wondering whether there's something, does the country love its writers?
They love books. They love this is a nation of readers.
Yeah.
The type of impact that, like the amount of support that we're getting and interest in the Charles Taylor Prize is incredible, and it is highly indicative of a country of readers and people who use books to feel like a country. Like they go to great lengths to want to feel like they're Canadian, and they use the book to do that. And I think that is a greater testament. Actually, I think the more pertinent question is how Canadian are our readers? They're very Canadian. The writing can seem, they're very accepting of writing from everywhere. It's the reading, the reading action that seems very significant to me.
Well, what do you mean the readers are very Canadian?
Well, they're doing the thing that makes it Canadian. They're doing that's the reading. It's the consumption of books. It's the interest in the word and in writing and getting rapped on your knuckles like Wade did, to make sure that the grammar's correct. I think that sort of interest in language and pride in and the drawing life from books
Wade,
is the Canadian part.
What's your experience, Wade, about whether or not this country prizes, loves, or respects its authors enough?
Oh, I think Canadians love to read. I think they have huge pride. I mean, I think the big crucible for Canada is to recognize you can be a Canadian writer and not necessarily have to write about Canada. I mean, when a country really matures into a certain self-confidence where its writers are bringing a particular Canadian sensibility because of their birthright to a world stage where any subject can be taken on. I mean, as a Canadian who sort of loves Canada, comes back to Canada all the time, still has homes and properties and works in Canada, but my world is really the whole globe. So I really don't think of myself as being in any way limited by my Canadianness, if you will. On the contrary, I like to think that the values that sort of the landscape breathed into my soul, my spirit, which is just, the essence of who you are, the wonderful thing is to be able to take that essence all through the planet and draw your inspiration, your subject matter, and perhaps bring to it a uniquely Canadian lens, and I think that's sort of the point where our literature will be really mature.
Charlotte, if you weren't nominated for a major prize, would you feel that the country loved you as an author?
I certainly hope so. I mean, even if it weren't for these grants, which really are amazing ways of surviving as an artist, I'd still write in the dirt with a stick.
Gotcha. Well, I want to, first of all, congratulate all 5 of you on your nomination for the 2012 Charles Taylor Prize, which will be announced on Monday, March the 5th. We wish you all good luck. The Governor General, apparently, will be going to your ceremony, so behave, everybody. Okay. Thank you all for being on the program. That was delightful. Wade Davis, Into the Silence. On our line from our studio in Los Angeles, California. Wade, good to have you on the program again. Charlotte Gill, Eating Dirt, J.J. Lee, The Measure of a Man, Madeline Sonic, Afflictions and Departures, Andrew Westall, The Chimps of Fauna Sanctuary. Good stuff, everybody. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.